Historians say history begins with writing, but art historians argue that pictures are history too. What survived of early art is often located in caves, and the most famous ones are in Europe, in France and Spain. Let's look at some of the earliest surviving human-made images, including stone tools, carved figurines, and petroglyphs. This series of crisscross lines was cut into stone about 40,000 years ago by Neanderthals, precursors of modern humans, who until recently had been considered incapable of abstract thought and expression. This discovery is a major contribution to the redefinition of our perception of Neanderthal culture. It's a new and even stronger evidence of the Neanderthal capacity for developing complex symbolic thought. Various artists' tools have been found in ancient caves, including lamps that burned fat, charcoal, ground pigment mixed with fat or urine or water from the cave, and evidence of scaffolding to paint on ceilings. This is a simulation of a cave painting toolkit containing brushes, sponges made out of moss, palettes, lamps, and pigments. In another news flash, a recent study by Penn State archaeologists suggests that 3/4 of the cave paintings in France and Spain may have been made by female artists. The scientist used measurements from 32 hand prints from 6 different caves, with data about the construction and size of hands and fingers of both sexes. He came to the conclusion that the majority of cave artists were female. This visual from your textbook, Figure 1.1, is of perhaps the most famous cave paintings in the world, those of Lascaux Cave, from 10 to 15,000 years before the Common Era. Meggs writes, random placement and shifting scale signify prehistoric people's lack of structure and sequence in recording their experiences. I do not agree, and neither do some new analysts of cave paintings. People now view the overlapping figures as being a way of indicating either space, foreground and background, or time. Along with these paintings, overwhelmingly representing animals, are various repeated symbols and abstract shapes. Were these artists reaching towards writing? The lines above the second horse here could be seen as proto-writing or trial writing. This bison is from another famous cave in Altamira, Spain, and demonstrates both accuracy in reproducing an animal that's now extinct, as well as showing a distinct mastery of style. At the Chevaux Cave in France, a more recently discovered find, there are thousands of paintings done over thousands of years. They cover every conceivable surface, and some of them are in almost unreachable areas, including deep inside crevasses and in 3D form all around the sides of stalactites. All theories about what these paintings mean are just that, theory. The experience of seeing them in person is supposedly extremely emotional. Possibly they were designed to bring tribal or mythical stories to life, with a combination of three-dimensionality, flickering flames from a lamp, shadows cast on the wall by moving people, scary cave sounds, and perhaps special effects like music or sound coming from other places in the cave. Other theories include that the art was part of either religious or hunting rituals. This animation, created from reproductions of the drawings, suggests what they may have looked like as you moved around them by flickering firelight. The most common symbol in cave art, however, are hand signs. They're common through all early art, universal in the European caves of Aurignacian art. At first, the short fingers were thought to be mutations or missing fingers, but they're now more widely viewed as just one finger bent down. It could be that the hands were representing silent signing, a language, or tribal gestures. Ancient Spain. Until Roman conquest, the Spanish peninsula was home to Iron Age people known as the Iberians, the Celtiberians, Tartessians, Lusitanians, and Vascones. Its Mediterranean shores were settled by Phoenician, Carthaginian, and Greek traders. These city-states were then conquered by the Roman legions, when the region was first known as Hispania. After the fall of Rome, it was occupied by Germanic invaders known as Visigoths, who were then defeated by Muslim forces, who were then reconquered by Catholic monarchs. The Visigothic Code, first written in 642, abolished the old tradition of having different laws for Romans and Visigoths. Under the new law, subjects would stop being Romani and Gothi, instead becoming Hispani. It combined elements of the Roman law, Catholic law, and Germanic tribal laws. This fragment of an 11th century copy of the Visigothic Code was translated to the Old Catalan language. Meanwhile, in ancient France, France was part of the Celtic territory known as Gaul or Gallia. Its present name is derived again from the Romans' Latin Francia, meaning country of the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic people who conquered the area during the 5th century at the time of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It became a separate country in the 9th century. Francia became the country of the Franks under Charlemagne's rule in 800, and then finally the Kingdom of France in 987. This Gallican lectionary in Latin on parchment is from around 700 CE. It's from the Abbey of Luxeuil, founded by the great Irish monk St. Columban on the ruins of a Roman castle. It soon became the most important monastery in Gaul, but was sacked by the Vandals in 731, and most of the community of its monks massacred. The monastery continued in operation until the French Revolution, but never recovered its former glory. This lectionary contains descriptions of Gallican rites, feast days, and masses. This Merolingian manuscript dates from around 750 and is titled Figures of Speech from the Heptateuch. It concerns the first 7 books of the Bible and the proper translation of the expressions in it from the Latin. The manuscript is known for the unusual way in which both the letter A and the letter Z are written. It includes many ornate initials, animal images based on the local metalwork style, and decorative titles. It was eventually handed over after the French Revolution in 1796 with other manuscripts from the Abbey. Emperor Charlemagne was a Frankish knight who unified most of Western Europe, including what's now Spain and France, around 800 CE. He shared power with the Pope and held authority over both church and state. His rule was important to design history because as part of fostering a revival of learning in the arts, he mandated the reform of illustration and writing by royal edict in 789 CE. King Charles, or Charlemagne, was a lover of books, sometimes having them read to him during meals. His court played a key role in producing books that taught elementary Latin and different aspects of the Church. Most of the surviving works of classical Latin were copied and preserved by Carolingian scholars. If a classical text survived to the Carolingian age, there's a good chance we are still reading it today. This work, called the Coronation Gospels, was created in 800 CE at the time of the coronation of Charlemagne. In this dramatic spread, St. Mark sits in a natural landscape on a page of deep crimson-stained parchment. The facing page is stained a deep purple with gold lettering. As the first pan-European ruler, Charlemagne tried to standardize not only law, church, and governance across his realms, but also instituted standards in writing. These Caroline minuscules, the precursor to lowercase letters that we use today, are from the Bible manuscript written by the English scholar Alcuin under Charlemagne's influence. The new writing style incorporated aspects of Roman uncials with features from scripts used in English and Irish monasteries. This page is from a collection of laws called the Capitularies of Charlemagne and his son, Louis the Pious. The text is in Caroline minuscules with headings in rustic and a version of square capitals. This copy of an interpretation of the Book of Job from the Old Testament is an example of the Caroline minuscule at its most refined and elegant. It was written in Latin during the reign of Pope Gregory the Great in France in the 11th or 12th century. This famous labyrinth page from the same Moralia in Job features a tile-like pattern inspired by Moorish art. Starting in the center of the top line, the inscription reads down, left, and then right, establishing a labyrinth of letter forms. The labyrinth idea was carried over from Minoan and Greek rituals, including an Easter ritual of dancing on a labyrinth. This circular labyrinth walking maze was built into the floor of the cathedral in Chartres, France in the 12th century, definitely a remnant of pagan practices. Manuscripts produced in medieval Spain were influenced by the Persian style and the Moorish style, with elaborate illustrations, although with Christian religious iconography. This is the Four Horsemen page of a commentary on the Apocalypse by a Spanish monk named Beatus. The year 800 was predicted to be the end of the world, and Beatus collected various manuscripts and prophecies into one well-written account that deeply affected all of Europe. His striking illustrations are both beautiful and terrifying. Here, the angel's wing feathers are as sharp and menacing as daggers. The trumpet, wings, and tail bring an angular counterpoint to the horizontal bands of color. The style blends Roman, Middle Eastern, and North African influences. The Pauline epistles from the mid-12th century is a supreme example of the French Gothic-style manuscript. The serpentine initial letter on the left-hand page recalls the complexity of Celtic designs from an earlier age in France. This palm-sized trinity and adoring choirs of angels was illuminated by the so-called Master of Claude de France for Queen Claude of France in 1517. Such handheld books of prayers were called Books of Hours and contained prayers for different hours, days, and religious holidays. The Book of Hours was Europe's most popular illustrated manuscript, produced by hand for members of the literate classes, which would have included only clergy, the aristocracy, and the very wealthy. They included religious texts for each hour of the day, prayers, and calendars that listed important saints' days and holidays. The most famous example of an illuminated Book of Hours was created by two artists called the Limburg brothers for their patron, the French Duke of Berry in France. Notice that at this period in 1413, we have started to be able to name and trace the history of the artist and manuscript production. In this Book of Hours, both pictorial and written information is presented with clarity, attesting to a high level of observation and visual organization. This priceless masterpiece contains beautiful calendar pages featuring scenes not only from the Bible but from the contemporary secular world. In this January-February calendar page, you can see a lady hoisting her skirt to warm her feet by the fire, and in the background, the laborers chopping the wood and caring for the sheep that would make such a warm scene possible. And here we see a young cleric being baptized in a very Middle Eastern-inspired arched room with latticed windows, while gruesome carved gargoyles support the baptismal font. In this royal scene, with a battle in the background and a feast in the foreground, details like the two cats on the top of the table and a dog being fed scraps underneath it draw you in and relate the ancient past to the modern day. Each calendar page had lunar and astrological calendars on top, with holy days marked and seasonal illustrations. Here, pigs are loose in the woods to be fattened on acorns in the fall. As printing spread through early Renaissance Europe, it came to France via a German professor at the Sorbonne University in Paris. In Paris in 1470, Martin Krantz, Michael Freiberger, and Ulrich Gehring produced the first printed book. It was titled Epistolae, Letters, by Gasperinus de Bergamo, and was intended as an exemplar of Latin grammar. By 1498, French printers were producing masterpieces like this page from the Hours of the Blessed Virgin Mary by Philippe Piguichet. The dense complexity of illustration, typography, and ornaments compressed into the space simulates an illuminated manuscript and is typical of Piguichet's book design. This costly edition, printed on vellum, clearly demonstrates the continuity of page design from manuscripts to the era of printing from movable type, with its ornaments, pattern, and medieval look. A particularly French contribution to early printing is the technique of criblé, where black areas of a printing block are punched with white dots. Not only does criblé lighten the look of the large initial caps, it saves ink and is easier to print than large, densely inked areas of black. Ornamental elements included headpieces, an ornamental design at the top of a page. Likewise, a tailpiece is an ornamental design at the bottom of the page. Printing was also imported to Spain via Germany. The Synodal de Aguila Fuente is the first book printed in Spain and in the Spanish language. It was printed in Segovia in the workshop of Juan Paris de Heidelberg, a German printer who came from Rome. Note the Carolingian-style Latin minuscules. The first Spanish press was set up in 1473 at Valencia, where the German Trading Company of Ravensburg had an important base. Titled Tarente la Blanche, it was a chivalric romance written by the Valencian knight Joanot Martorell. Spain quickly evolved its own distinctive style of book, full of dignity and printed largely in black letter types. From Spain, printing crossed the Atlantic during this early period. The most remarkable production of the period was the magnificent Complutensian Polyglot Bible, which presented the text of the Bible in several languages in adjacent columns. It was sponsored by the Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros to revive the hitherto dormant study of the Scriptures, which it effectively did. The Polyglot Bible was the result of Spain's long-lasting tradition of translations of texts. Through centuries, the intellectual class of Iberia had developed a deep understanding of the issues of translation and the difficulty of conveying or even interpreting meaning correctly across languages. It was printed in Hebrew, Chaldee, Syriac, Greek, and Latin by Arnaldo Guillermo de Bracar, the first great Spanish printer. Editorial work was begun in 1502 and the book was finally issued in 1522. In this title page from 1515, the title almost becomes an afterthought in the overall design of the page. The use of white on black woodcuts and heraldic imagery is typical of early Spanish graphic design. During the French Renaissance, the humanist spirit took hold in France and produced both excellent scholarship and a notable school of book design. The leading French printers produced books of fine proportions, outstanding legibility, beautiful type, elegant ornaments, and a new, open, lighter style. Geoffrey Torrey was a true Renaissance man, a professor, scholar, and translator, poet, author, publisher, printer, and bookseller, calligrapher, designer, illustrator, and engraver. He translated, edited, and often published Latin and Greek texts. Among his other typographical innovations, he introduced the apostrophe, the accent mark, and the cedilla. In this book, the armorial frontispiece and 40 vignettes have orderly rows of the Latin alphabet's 23 letter forms over a blue field with red and white stripes. Geoffrey Torrey had a famous printer's mark called the pot cassé, or broken pot. He used it as a trademark emblem and logo, and designed it after the death of his daughter. The broken jar is a metaphor for a broken body. The auger, the drill piece that goes through the center, is a metaphor for fate, and the locked book is a metaphor for shut by death. Here we see a close-up of his famous Criblé initials from 1526. They were engraved for the publisher Robert Estienne. This alphabet of Roman capitals brought elegance and color to the pages of printed books at Estienne's press. In this book, The Hours of Our Excellent Virgin Mary, we can see Torrey's beautiful floral and animal motif borders. They were made of open lines to allow for hand coloring later in personal illuminated editions. The royal F in the bottom of the left-hand page is an homage to King Francis I. Not to be outdone, Geoffrey Torrey also created a book about his typographic design called Champ Fleury in 1529. Here we see the construction of his letters Q, V, and R. To construct a geometrically ideal Roman O, he used 5 compass centers, and he used 2 more to add a tail for the Q. The book, subtitled The Art and Science of the Proportion of the Attic or Ancient Roman Letters According to the Human Body and Face, is the most famous example of the Renaissance pursuit of an ideal proportion between humans and letter forms. He carefully analyzes errors in Albrecht Dürer's letterform designs and offers instructions in the geometric construction of the alphabet on background grids of 100 squares. The humanist idea that Roman philosophers, poets, and orators live on in spirit through the power of Roman letters is illustrated in this spread. The 13 alphabets that conclude the book, including Hebrew, Greek, Persian, and so on, include this whimsical sequence of pictorial letter forms composed of tools. A is a compass, B is a steel used to strike a flint to a fire, and C is a handle. This title page by Simon de Caylins for a book called De Natura Stirpium Librae Tres in 1536 takes great liberties with natural scale and perspective to create a joyous interpretation of the natural bounty of the earth's flora. Working as a partner with Simon de Caylins was Aurence Fine, a mathematics professor, mapmaker, author, and graphic artist. He illustrated his own mathematics, geography, and astronomy books, and used mathematical construction for ornaments, and the robust clarity of his graphic illustration is the work of an innovative graphic designer. This amazing global map is an example of his work, with the Latin inscription across the gold-toned Antarctic continent reading, "Southern land newly discovered but not yet fully explored." Another example of his intricate, mathematically based illustration. This collaboration between Simon de Caylins, the printer, and Aurence Fine, the designer, shows a beautiful title page border with symbolic figures representing various areas of knowledge and a criblé background. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical themes include such items as this polyphily from 1546. Poly meaning many and phili meaning love. We see a satyr and a nymph eyeing each other amidst an abundant harvest that give the reader a glimpse of the pagan adventures held within the book. Now let's look at the fascinating era of France in the 1700s as it moved from empire to enlightenment. To understand France in this period, we have to remember who was king. This was Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, a portrait of him by Hyacinth 1801. There's his royal emblem and his royal signature. Louis XIV wanted to establish a new center for his royal court. He settled on the Royal Hunting Lodge at Versailles, and over the following decades had it expanded into one of the largest palaces in the world. Although he called it his humble hunting lodge, these gilded gates are an apt metaphor for the separation between the French nobility and their subjects. This painting of the Sun King holding court at Versailles shows a respectful count approaching the king and strewing laurel wreaths on the steps, while captured enemy flags are displayed on both sides. These copperplate engravings by Louis Simoneau were intended to establish graphic standards for a new royal alphabet called the Roman du Roi in 1700. The title refers to the Roman alphabet, and du Roi means for the king. In this detailed drawing, we see the underlying gridded architecture for the letters G and H. You may have noticed the Metropolitan Museum logo and its resemblance to these drawings. Compared to earlier Roman fonts, the crisp geometric quality and increased contrast of this first transitional typeface are clearly evident. Here we see the title page for the first type specimen book of Pierre-Simon Fournier-Lejeune. This is called Models of Printing Characters from 1742. Lejeune also printed this title page for a collection of short arias set to music in 1756. Vast numbers of floral, curvilinear, and geometric ornaments were needed to construct designs like this, which set the standard of excellence for the Rococo period. Roccoco was a style of fanciful French art and architecture that flourished from about 1720 until around 1770. Florid and intricate, Roccoco ornament is composed of S and C curves, with scroll work, tracery, and plant forms derived from nature, classical and oriental art, and even medieval sources. Light pastel colors were often used with ivory, white, and gold in asymmetrically balanced designs. In this period, it was not less is more, but more is more, or better yet, too much is not enough. The excesses of Rococo perfectly symbolize the excesses of the French nobility. This example of Rococo architecture is from a Bavarian church, designed as total works of art with elegant and ornate furniture, small sculptures, ornamental mirrors, and tapestry that complemented the architecture, reliefs, and wall paintings. It was largely supplanted later by the Neoclassic style. Like architecture, Rococo fashion delighted in excess, decoration, bows, flowers, and frippery. This era was the beginning of the French fashion plate, printed drawings of court fashions that were distributed internationally so that wealthy people could have their private tailors or seamstresses copy immediately any style seen in court. To adorn this poem about a painter's romantic interlude with his subject, Joseph Gerard Barbeau used an etching of the event, a topical tailpiece by Chauffard and Fournier-Lejeune's ornamented type. In 1764, Pierre-Simon Fournier-Lejeune printed his masterwork, Manuel Typographique. In addition to showing the design accomplishments of a lifetime, his type manual is a masterwork of Roccoco design. Volume 2 displays specimens of alphabets as well as Fournier's vignettes and ornaments. This engraving is of Louis XV visiting the Academy of Sciences in 1671. The engraving was by the artist Louis René Deleuze. It was widely accepted that modern science arose in the Europe of the 17th century, introducing a new understanding of the natural world. Louis René Deleuze was the official engraver of King Louis XV. A type designer and punch cutter at the Imprimerie Royale from 1740 to 1770, he designed a series of types that were narrow and condensed with sharp serifs. All of these French typographers worked with a character called the Royal L. So strong were this detail's connotations that the spurred L was preserved for generations by type founders who served the French crown. The spur halfway up its left side makes the lowercase l one of the most conspicuous characters in the Roman du Roi. The flourish has calligraphic credentials appearing on the stem of all ascenders in the Gothic lowercase in both written and printed form. Here we see Didot's 32-point Gothique from the 1819 Specimen des Characters. Louis René Deleuze also designed a large series of letterpress borders, ornaments, trophies, and other devices. They were cast in modular sections, then assembled in place by a compositor. The density of the line and ornaments was carefully planned to be visually compatible with his typefaces, and they often had an identical weight so that they matched. These detailed and calligraphic ornaments express the authority and absolutism of the French monarchy. It's worth noting that at this point, printing presses had improved considerably since Gutenberg's time and could print far more detailed fine lines. This fanciful engraving for the frontispiece of the book in 1761, Flus's Essay of the New Typography, we can see small cherubs acting as metaphors for printing, science, and the crown. In this fanciful period, I have to look at the costumes of the trades and professions, a successful series of printed broadsides, about 100 of them that were published over a period of several years by Nicolas L'Armesson, who was part of the famous L'Armesson family, engravers and printers who worked and functioned in the 17th and 18th century. These were called the costumes grotesques, or habits des métiers et professions. In other words, crazy things that people wear who do different jobs. The popular success was ensured by every job having an equally outrageous set of outfits. This is the musician's clothes. And here we have the baker's clothes, the boilermaker's clothes, the clothes of the sculptor, the fisherman's clothes. Might have been a little smelly. And the bouquet maker's clothes, from 1690. The miller's clothes, from 1690. The doctor's clothes. Notice the electricity emanating from his mouth. Here is the fireworks maker's clothes. And the belt maker's and gardener's outfits. We have not yet touched on French The French colonies were established in two different waves. In the 1600s, France, as an early explorer of North and South America, established colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and India. Through wars, they lost most of the possessions to Britain and Spain, and then regained Louisiana, called New France, in 1800. The territory was then sold to the United States in 1803 as the Louisiana Purchase. The second wave of French colonialism was after This work, attributed to an artist called Frere Luc, Brother Luc, is called France Bringing the Faith to the Hurons of New France, and it's from 1666. It's one of the oldest landscapes painted in Canada. It depicts Anne of Austria, Louis XIV's regent, giving a religious painting to a kneeling Huron man on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. This allegorical work is meant to represent France saving the Aboriginal population by bringing them Christianity. Paintings like this illustrate how Europeans often found moral justification for the ugly business of colonization. Further justification for the acts of colonialism was produced by the wide distribution of prints like this, depicting the martyrdom of 2 French priests by indigenous people of North America. Another area 1850, when they invaded and colonized after 1850, when they invaded and colonized new empires, mostly in Africa, Indochina, and the South Pacific. Typically, the colonies supplied raw materials and purchased manufactured items, spread the French language and the Catholic religion, and provided manpower in both world wars. There was a project of civilizing the populations by spreading language and religion, and that was used as justification for brutality. After 1945, Indochina and Algeria successfully threw off French rule and became independent. The French were among the earliest modern explorers to, quote, rediscover the great monuments of the ancient Egyptians. Napoleon Bonaparte landed in Egypt in 1798 to block Britain's access to its trade routes to India. Napoleon had a grand vision of empire and was told that a conquest of Egypt would more than compensate for the loss of the West Indian colonies to the British. He brought along approximately 150 architects, artists, students, scientists, and engineers, whose job was to record everything. The temples and tombs of Luxor, Philae, Dendera, and the Valley of the Kings were measured, mapped, and drawn by artists. Jean-Francois Champollion, another area of brutal French colonization, was Indochina, today known as Vietnam. These engravings from the French publication Le Monde show views of Hanoi and the Tonkin in 1891 during the era of colonization. At the turn of the 20th century, the growing automobile industry in France resulted in the growth of rubber industry in French Indochina, and plantations were built throughout the colony. France soon became a leading producer of rubber through its colony, and Indochinese rubber became prized in the industrialized world. The success of rubber plantations resulted in an increase in investment in the colony by various firms such as Michelin. With a growing number of investments in the colony's mines and rubber, tea, and coffee plantations, French Indochina began to industrialize as factories opened in the colony. These new factories established a near monopoly on the trade of opium, salt, and rice alcohol. The administration established quotas of consumption for each Vietnamese village, thereby compelling villagers to purchase and consume set amounts of these monopolized goods. Then we consider graphic design as a component of colonialization. We have to think about the introduction of power relationships and the structure of control through both hard and soft powers. Hard powers include the distribution of space, the use of surveillance and punishment, and military power. Soft powers include the use of education, the arts, and communication. In the struggle to free Vietnam from its colonial power, artists became soldiers. These protagonists risked their lives painting anti-French messages on walls, especially the leftover shells of bombed or dynamited buildings often found near French fortifications, as the structures had been cleared so as not to provide cover. Such activities are best described by those with experience of the times, as in the following passage. They asked me to go and draw and copy slogans at the village level, which means going into the heart of the enemy's territory. So I went by myself without even a backpack, only a sack containing a bit of gouache and a few clothing items. I didn't have much clothing, so it was mostly color pigments, brushes, and a bit of binding agent to mix the colors. At the village, I had an invitation paper from the office, and they sent along another person from the communication office. He took me close to the enemy's base, where there were pieces of walls called scorched earth, big brick houses or village temples bombed by the enemy left behind slabs of bare walls. We used those walls to write slogans to promote the resistance. I wrote and drew on those walls. Le Lam is widely considered to be Vietnam's preeminent living artist, acclaimed for both his propaganda art and equally for the quite extraordinary range, volume, and quality of his battlefield and campaign illustrations. These works number in the thousands, the result of several decades in the field. Here he tutors a young artist as she draws a poster for the resistance. Le Lam designed the above poster in 1968 as a tribute to the courage of female fighters and civilian protesters. This 1960s poster by an artist signed Ho Tu has an amazing repetition of pattern and togetherness, showing women in native costume. This poster depicts the stranglehold that France had on Indochina. When Vietnam achieved independence as a new country, it had to create both new money and new stamps. These images show wild animals native to the region and insects on diagonal diamond-shaped stamps. This is another early stamp showing traditional designs. Resistance posters also were produced during the Vietnam-American War. This one shows 4,000 determined American aircrafts bombing Vietnam. And this view of another heroic female fighter is titled For Our Future. Renee Medeiros, a self-taught artist from Sagua La Grande in Cuba, began work in a Havana print shop in 1944. In 1964, he began creating his first posters as head of the design team of the propaganda organization Intercommunications. In 1969, he was assigned by DOR to travel to Vietnam to paint scenes of the war. Medeiros traveled to both North and South Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail with the Liberation Forces, experiencing the brutal conditions of war firsthand. His paintings were exhibited in Hanoi and were subsequently reproduced as a screen-printed series, which has been shown all over the world. Several of the images were reproduced in the United States as part of the anti-war efforts and in Cuba as a set of postage stamps. His style, with its bright, firmly contoured surfaces, patterns in nature, and a strong political theme, established a unique standard for graphic design in Cuba, which influenced graphic artists in Vietnam and all over the world. Another effect of colonialism was the seizure of works of art and artifacts from French colonies. Contemporary activists are trying to have them repatriated to the countries from which they were stolen. In this photo, we see the President of Senegal receiving the sword of Omar Saidou Tall during a ceremony on November 17th. It had been held in France as part of the Quai Branly Museum on the banks of the Seine River. This throne of King Gezo, a ruler of Dahomey, is also slated to return to Benin from France. Okay, back to France, the Scientific Revolution. The French Royal Academy of Science and the English Royal Society of London were established to officially pursue scientific and philosophical study. The number of books about science and art published in Paris doubled in the 1700s. Books about religion dropped to 1/10 of the total. The age of Francis Bacon and the scientific method, Isaac Newton in physics, Johann Kepler in astronomy, and Descartes in mathematics was to begin. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement which dominated the world of ideas in Europe. Ideas such as individual liberty, religious tolerance, and scientific investigation ruled the day, as opposed to absolute monarchy in France and the fixed dogmas of the Roman Catholic Church. Here we have the aesthetically uninteresting but philosophically important title page of The Philosophy of Mathematics by Isaac Newton from 1656. Enlightenment was taking place all across Europe, from German philosophy, Scottish economics, English law, Italian science, all nations. The governments actively promoted the arts and sciences. Human rights issues like the abolition of slavery and the death penalty were contemporary issues. This was an age of scientific improvements and breakthroughs. Theories and the scientific method of inquiry ruled the day. These included the Montgolfier brothers, who launched the first manned flight in a hot air balloon on the 21st of November in 1783. And this rather steampunky illustration shows Antoine Lavoisier conducting an experiment related to the combustion generated by amplified sunlight. The French thinker René Descartes was a philosopher, mathematician, and scientist who developed analytic geometry in 1637. He used algebra for the first time to solve geometry problems. Famous for the saying, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum." And you might ask, what does Cartesian philosophy have to do with graphic design? Well, he created Cartesian coordinates, which are the basic elements of all graphing and charting. He developed a pair of numbers. The x and y coordinates are also called the Cartesian coordinates. The axis can form a grid of horizontal and vertical lines called a Cartesian grid. And this is in 1789, the tumultuous years of the French Revolution began. This portrait of Marianne, the national symbol of France, is seen frequently on numerous statues, coins, stamps, and banknotes, but the origin of the symbol Marianne remains unclear. She emerged as a single figurehead during the Revolutionary years and was often shown in heroic roles, leading the Republicans to freedom. Typically, she wore a Phrygian cap, a soft felt conical red hat, and this is now usually how Marianne is depicted. It's been claimed that the choice of a female as a symbol of France was a deliberate attempt to reject a male-dominated culture, but often the fourth and final stage of the French Revolution was the reign of the Emperor Napoleon. During this time, there was a renewed enthusiasm for the classics, including classical architecture and other forms, even fashion, in part because of his conquering of territories in Egypt and the Near East. This fascination with all things classical extended to typefaces. Neoclassic forms in the late 18th century, when first released, were called classical designs. Soon it was apparent that they were not updated versions of classic type, but altogether new designs, and were renamed modern. The neoclassic designs, as we know them, are characterized by order, simplicity, and symmetry. The Didot family were a dynasty of printers, publishers, paper makers, and type founders. Their dynasty began when François Didot established a printing and bookselling firm in Paris in 1713. Didot contributed the Bodonis in Italy and the Didots in France were rivals and kindred spirits who pushed the modern style of typefaces to the limit. The standard of Didot measurement was developed in 1780 by François Ambroise. The Pied de Roi, the official standard of measurement for identifying typefaces in France, was adopted by the Didot Type Foundry. Other innovations by this family include extremely thin, condensed style fonts, extremely fat, expanded style fonts, and the invention of stereotyping, a process that involves casting a duplicate of a relief print surface by pressing a molded material like paper pulp against it to make a matrix. Pierre Didot, the second generation, printed this lovely title page for a book called Letters of a Peruvian in 1797. This title page rivals anything created by Bodoni in Italy. The typeface used in this book is an early presentation of a true modern style letter form, with straight hairline serifs, extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes, and construction along a vertical axis. Those are another neoclassic masterpiece. These pages from Virgil's Bucolica were printed in 1798. This double-page spread shows the perfection, lavish margins, and cool understatement of neoclassical graphic design. We'll skip forward to the 1800s to the age of Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau was an international decorative style that thrived roughly during the 2 decades at the turn of the century, from 1890 to 1910. Art Nouveau's identifying visual quality is an organic, plant-like line. Vine tendrils, flowers such as the rose and lily, birds, particularly peacocks, and the human female form were frequent motifs from which this fluid line was adapted, and nowhere was it more fluid and more floral than in France. The posters of La Belle Époque, the Beautiful Era. New French law allowed posters to be hung anywhere except on churches, at polls, or in areas designated for official notices. Afficheurs were poster hangers, and their industry boomed. French Art Nouveau had its beginnings in Paris in 1888, where Age Jean Grasset. Jules Cheret created color lithographic posters for clients including music halls, theaters, beverages, medicines, household products, entertainers, and publications. Cheret's early green and black poster used the multiples. The swirling lettering is a foreshadowing of his mature style. Cheret gradually evolved towards larger, more animated figures and greater unity of word and image. This poster is for the gasoline used in gas lights. In one of his most famous works, for the Palace de Glace, or Ice Palace, you see a Parisian elegance, carefree grace, and astounding technical mastery. The figures create a lively play of angles, linking the top and bottom letters. As with any of his larger posters, it was necessary to print this one in 2 sections, making it almost twice as big as life-size. The women in Cheret's poster became known as Cherettes. They were joyous, elegant, and lively, and heralded a more open atmosphere in Paris. Women were now able to engage in formerly taboo activities such as wearing low-cut bodices and smoking in public. This poster has an unusual combination of high-kicking gentlemen and a woman in a long, swirling dress. In this poster, you can see how Cheret evolved the use of color lithography to be almost as painterly as paint on fabric. The Swiss-born artist Eugene Grasset rivaled Cheret in popularity. He was noted for his total integration of illustration, format, and typography. I think of him as representing a coloring book style with a thick black contour drawing that locked forms into flat areas of color. His flowing line and floral motifs pointed towards the high points of French Art Nouveau. In this title page, Grasset divides the space into zones, unifying lettering, illustration, and decorative pattern into a total page design. The book is about 4 stalwart sons of the Count A. In this exhibition poster from 1894, the figures are quietly demure instead of exuberant, and project a resonance very different from that of Cheret. The color Theo Steinlen was a friend and sometimes rival of Toulouse-Lautrec. He was a prolific illustrator who often depicted poverty, exploitation, and the working class. His commissions included magazine covers, magazine and book illustrations, sheet music, and large posters. A widely reproduced poster that he designed is of this black cat. In this poster for a printing company, we see a cross-section of Parisian society, a mother and baby, a washerwoman, 2 workers, his own daughter Colette with her nanny, and a businessman and sophisticated shoppers, all promenading in a nearly life-size echo of the adjacent sidewalks. Here we see a poster of his for sterilized milk, with the focal point created by the shape of the red dress. Like many artists, Steinlen developed his own distinctive signature featured in the top right-hand corner of this rooster poster. Here we see a modern bicycle-riding lady disturbing a flock of geese. And again, although technically not from France, I'm including Alphonse Mucha, a Czechoslovakian artist who worked in France. From about 1895 to 1900, this young Czech's dominant theme was a central female figure surrounded by stylized forms derived from plants and flowers, Moravian folk art, Byzantine mosaics, and even magic and the occult. Mucha's women project an archetypal sense of. This sketch of Mucha's daughter in the 1920s reveals the surety of his hand even in sketch. This poster of Sarah Bernhardt appearing as Gizmonda created an overnight sensation and helped to make Sarah famous throughout Europe. Again here he used a life-sized figure with a mosaic pattern and an elongated shape to use. By 1900, Alphonse Mucha's work had become pervasive in the development of Art Nouveau's graphic motifs. Here the pensive female figure seems mesmerized by the plethora of stylized plant forms surrounding her. Le style Mucha was often used interchangeably with l'Art Nouveau. Mucha delighted in filling the total space with animated form and ornament. This poster advertised the services of a lithographer in 1897. Ah, how charming. Female artist. Jane Ache was a French poster artist of the Art Nouveau movement. She designed color and black and white lithographs and was influenced by Mucha's style. She won awards including an honorable mention at the Salon of the Société des Artistes Français in 1902. Here is her version of a Job Cigarette Girl. Her figures combine Mucha's graphic curves and flowing linear forms with more painterly softness. She was famous for a series of 4 seasons. A perfect Art Nouveau theme, princesses, a peacock, and landscapes. These 2 decorative panels by Jane Ache are titled Reverie and Meditation. The spread of the style of Art Nouveau was not just confined to graphic design. It eventually included all the design arts: architecture, furniture, product design, fashion and fabrics, teapot, dishes and spoons, chairs, door frames, staircases, factories, subway entrances, and houses. And interestingly, these evolved first from graphic art and then into the other art forms. A few examples of the metropolitan entrances. The total design of Art Nouveau is exemplified in this poster for The Modern House, La Maison Moderne, in 1905. Furniture, objects, clothing, jewelry, and even the woman's hair evidence the totality of the Art Nouveau movement. Because both France and Spain are so instrumental in the design of the modern era, we'll pick up more from these countries in Historical Survey Part B.